Spring has sprung here in the city, and that means the lazy days of summer are fast approaching. If you're looking for some new reads, well, you've tuned in at the right time because Chris Hall from McNally Robinson Booksellers has popped into the studio this Friday morning. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Great to see you. Happy June.
Thank you. Happy June to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. What have you brought this month to feature?
Selection. This one angles towards the local a little bit. I guess we'll notice that as we go along. The first book I brought in, another cookbook. I seem to be on a run of bringing in cookbooks.
That's fine by me. You can keep that coming.
This one is called The Prairie Table by Karlynn Johnston. The subtitle is Suppers, Potlucks, and Socials, Crowd-Pleasing Recipes to Bring People Together. So how's that for a cookbook that brings it home?
No kidding. Feels very familiar already.
Yeah, absolutely. She had a previous book called Flapper Pie and a Blue Prairie Sky. Flapper pie was a traditional pie made in the prairies, apparently, and so we had some luck with that. So this is her new installment. She is also known as the Kitchen Magpie.
She's got that blog, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
You're aware of it.
Yeah.
Yes, she lives in Edmonton. So this is a real celebration of prairie cooking. It's not exclusive to prairie ingredients, but you'll find Saskatoon berries and you'll find rhubarb and a chapter that celebrates the Ukrainian influence on prairie cooking. So it's really an emphasis on family gatherings and neighborhood gatherings and community gatherings, and it's a really it's an attractive book. It's got great photography. Her husband, Mr. Magpie, as she calls Kitchen Magpie, as she calls him, has some drink recipes to
nice.
Pair with some of these meals. So whether you've got a small gathering or a large gathering, it's got lots of possibilities for you.
Now, I have to say, I'd already heard about this book before you mentioned you were bringing it in, because I saw a recipe on Facebook, actually. It was kind of getting passed around. My dad's side of the family is from Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and in that Ukrainian heritage chapter, there's a recipe for beet leaf holubtsi, these cabbage rolls that we would always have every time we would go out there. And they're in the book. So, I mean, there's all sorts of very familiar recipes to me in there, and I'm sure to many. And it looks like a stunning book.
It really is, yeah. Cookbooks these days are really attractive. The photography is top notch, and that's why I'm fascinated with them. I think I just flip through them and find inspiration all over the place.
You and I both. Where are we going from there?
From there, we've got a big history book. This one's called Upheaval by Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond is famous for a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. That's one of the probably best-selling history books of the last decade or so. That's about how countries, European countries generally, created their empires. They did it with guns, then they did it with germs, smallpox and so on. They decimated populations, and steel, like trains and ships and things like that. So, and then he followed that up with a book called Collapse, basically how countries lost those empires. Now this one's called Upheaval. It's a book about countries that go into crises and how they recover. And he uses the metaphor of people going into crises. So if you have a personal crisis, what are the advice that you get from psychologists or from books or whatever? And so he applies that to countries. So things like advice like taking responsibility for your past, or going through honest self-appraisals, learning from role models, those sorts of things. And he applies that to countries. And he has 6 countries that he goes through. Everyone from Finland, when they faced a fight with Soviet Union just before the Second World War, and Japan's forced opening from the U.S. afterwards, Germany and Austria after the Second World War as they rebuilt, Chile and Indonesia with internal coups, and he just explores the response that these countries had, in all cases successful in certain definitions of the word, and so in this time of what it might feel like crises.
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty. Certainly uncertainty. Sure. Then what are the steps that other countries have done to get themselves through these moments? So it's kind of interesting. It's a big picture history book, and so the criticism of big picture history books is sometimes they gloss over the details. Yeah. The problem with a book that gets mired in the details is it loses the big picture. So I would always advise you to read these big picture books in tandem with some books that get into a little bit more detail. But he's very, very good at telling a big picture story.
I was reading a little bit more about Upheaval because I find this stuff fascinating, and I think they noted that he lived in 5 of the 6 countries. He speaks the languages, so he can kind of add these little personal anecdotes or conversations as well.
And that's certainly the charm of the book is his personal experiences. You may stretch that a little bit far just because you've lived somewhere for a little bit doesn't mean you know them.
Yeah, exactly.
But you probably know them better than you would just by studying them in your in your office at home. So yeah, it does lend certainly some connections and it makes for a more readable book for sure.
So with that idea of learning from the lessons of our past in mind, this segues rather nicely into this next selection, Indigenous Relations, the latest book by Bob Joseph.
Yes, Bob Joseph made a splash last year. He wrote a book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. This new book, Indigenous Relations, is subtitled Tips and Suggestions to Make Reconciliation a Reality. So he's trying to get at some of the more practical aspects of how we deal with the crisis that Indigenous people in Canada are doing. The book kind of goes through practical advice, but also kind of larger advice, like pointing out that Indigenous culture isn't a single culture. It's made up of a number of individual cultures, much like mainstream culture is made up of individual cultures. And it's something that we often forget when we're trying to deal both politically and personally. So he suggests the simple things like getting to know people, getting to know an Indigenous person or Indigenous community, or that's a very simple aspect. But then he gets the book is not just for individuals; it's for companies. Like I would consider my own up for this challenge. So he covers things like some of these Indigenous cultures had hereditary leadership, or leadership would pass on in a hereditary way. Others would be elected. So to have just elections doesn't work as smoothly across the board as it might otherwise. The intricacies and impact of the Indian Act itself. If you don't know what the Indian Act is, that's a big gap in trying to figure out where to go from here. His previous book tackled that in particular. This one continues from there. So basically just issuing kind of some advice for mainstream culture and what we can do. I would count myself in that group, and what can we do to help to make things better for everybody.
Totally, and this is a conversation that he's been facilitating for many years, right? He organized a worldwide Indigenous Peoples Roundtable as well. So just finding these, it almost seems like a simple solution, but it's so true, right?
It is
just,
so true,
have a conversation with people, talk to them and learn about them. We kind of keep close to home with the next selection. Can you tell us about this next one with a very beautiful cover, I might add?
It's got a great cover.
Yeah, great illustration.
Yeah, this one is called Treed by Ariel Gordon, Walking in Canada's Urban Forests. It's Canada's urban forest, but it's a real emphasis on Winnipeg and in Manitoba. Ariel is a local poet and journalist. So, yeah, I will never walk in this city the same way again. I see trees when I walk. I cycle through a Assiniboine forest. I look for deer. I see the trees. But after reading this book, I'm going to see individual trees. I'm going to see mushrooms growing on their trunks. I'm going to see squirrels in their homes. And she does a really great job of appreciating the urban forest, the number of the amount of nature that is within, especially this city. The green canopy in Winnipeg is well.
It's really magnificent.
It is, and so she's a naturalist, as she calls herself, but she's always lived in a city, always lived in mostly Winnipeg, and so she comes at nature from this angle. She also gets into some of the history. Like, there's a reason why we have all these elm trees. People planted them, and so who are these people, and what were they thinking, and where did these parks come from? Why do we have this Assiniboine Park in the middle of our city? What created that? Why is it still there? It's remarkable sometimes why these parks are where they are, and she explores some of that history. So it's a really interesting book. Makes one more mindful. That's kind of a current buzzword these days. Mindful not only of your surroundings, but what created it and how it got to be this way, etc.
Does she get into any of the challenges that tree canopy is facing? Like, I mean, of course, I'm thinking of Dutch elm or the emerald ash borer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So no, she doesn't shy away from that. She and also just like specific examples of climate change that you can have literally in your front boulevard if you learn to to notice and learn what those signs are. Yeah, absolutely.
Really hits close to home.
It certainly does. It's a very good read. She's a very entertaining author too, so that's she's a very good guide.
Nice. This last selection kind of changes the idea of home, or plays with that idea, I should say. The Travel Dream. What can you tell us about this last selection, Chris?
This one is called Don't Try This at Home. It's by Daria, Salamon, and Rob Krause. They are a couple. They have 2 children, and they decided to take a year off and travel the world. And so their youngest, I believe they were 5 and 8, their children, when they left, a son and a daughter. And so the challenges of just pulling up stakes and going to see the world. And the challenges, Daria, if you know Daria, you know you're in for a laugh. She's a very entertaining, funny person. And so this book is a very funny take on their challenges and how you raise children, how you stretch a budget, for example, and bargain and maybe tell some white lies and have your kids expose you for that. That's one point or one part that I remember. It's they went a lot of South America, a lot of Asia, 15 countries in total. They had their challenges. Wow. One of them lost a parent while they were away, so they had to come back. Things like that. So not just humorous. It's heartwarming too, but again, very locally centered story, but a story about the world.
Oh wow, that sounds like a most ambitious project, and what a
indeed.
Tale to tell.
Oh, I know, yeah, and yes, always good for a laugh as you work through.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for coming by the studio this Friday morning. Lots of local selections this month.
Yeah,
really dig it.
Good opportunity.
Excellent. Well, you just heard from Chris Hall of McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can find his June edition of What to Read over on the shelves of McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can also find a link over at classic107.com.